kind of thing that we do when you're texting, for example. You get the wrong letter in there, but your phone actually knows, because it's context, what to correct it. So because the decoding is not 100% correct all the time, in fact, it's far from that, it's really helpful to have these other features like autocorrect, the stuff that we use routinely now with texting that makes it correct and then updates it. So it's a combination of a lot of things. It's the AI that is translating those brain activity patterns, but it's also things that we've learned from speech and speech technologies that, you put all together and then all of a sudden it starts to work. And so we were really excited because that was the first time that someone was paralyzed and could create words and sentences that was just decoded from the brain activity.
Incredible. And I know you're very humble, but I'm going to embarrass you by saying I always knew you were destined for great things since the early age of 9 when we first became friends. But when I read that the news coverage of your work with Poncho and the release of language from this locked-in patient, it literally, it brought tears to my eyes because it's an interesting thing as fellow neuroscientists, right? We explore the brain and we try and find mechanisms and we try and compare those to what other people find and find truths and principles and build up from those. But pretty rarely is there a case where that route of exploration leads to something of clinical significance within one's own lifetime. I mean, that's the reality of science, and oftentimes it's a very distributed process. But in this case, it's been a magnificent thing to see you move along this trajectory, parsing these language and speech areas, and then to also do the clinical work in parallel. Speaking of which, these days we hear a lot about Neuralink, right? Elon Musk's company, a neurosurgeon that came up briefly through my lab, but I can't take any credit for what he knows or does, which is Matt McDougall is the neurosurgeon at Neuralink. There's some other excellent neuroscientists there and engineers there. We hear a lot about Neuralink because while brain-machine interface of the sort that you do and that other laboratories do has been going on for a long time, there's been some press around Neuralink about the promise of what brain-machine interface could do. For instance, early in our discussion, you talked about how, language is constrained by these sound waves, and typically it's a few people communicating or one person with many people through a podcast, for instance, or a speech. But the idea has been thrown out there that through the use of stimulating chips or through other brain-machine devicing, that perhaps one could internalize 50 conversations in parallel, right? 50x communication. Or that the memory systems could be augmented to remember 10 times as much information, or even twice as much information in a given period of time. My understanding of what they're doing at Neuralink, which is admittedly crude and from the outside, a few discussions with people there, is that they too are going to pursue clinical goals first. Things like trying to generate smooth movement in a Parkinsonian patient, trying to adjust movement patterns in someone with Huntington's disease, for instance, things of that sort, before they embark on the kind of more sci-fi like explorations of 50xing communication or doubling memory capacity and these kinds of things. Although I don't know, they may be doing all of those things in parallel. What are your thoughts about super capabilities of the brain or super, I don't even know what word to use, supercharging the brain, giving the brain functions for which we've never observed before in human history, right? We have our Einsteins and our Feynmans and our Merzeniks and it's unclear who to put in along that line side by side, but they're Michael Jordans and et cetera, but we've never heard of or seen somebody who can jump 20 feet in the air, or we've heard of people who have photographic memories, but I don't know that we are aware of any human being in history who could memorize the entire Library of Congress or all the works within the Vatican within an hour. Anyway, you get the idea. What are your thoughts about manipulating neural circuitry to achieve suprahuman or superhuman or supraphysiological functions? Are we there? Should we even be thinking about that? Is it possible, given that neurons simply communicate through electrical activity and electrical activity can be engineered outside of the brain. How do you think about it? And here we don't even have to think about Neuralink in particular. It's just but one example of companies and people in laboratories that are quite understandably considering all this.
Well, it's a really interesting time right now. The science has been going on for decades. The work that we've done in this field that you call brain-machine interface has been going on for a while. And a lot of the early work was just trying to restore things like arm movement or having people or monkeys control a computer cursor, for example, on a screen. That's been going on for decades. What's been really new is that industry is now involved, and some of this is now becoming commercialized, and we're starting to see us now cross over to this field where it's no longer just research, that we're talking about medical products that are designed to be, surgically implanted. In some cases, there's people doing this kind of work non-invasively as well that don't require surgery. The specific question that you are asking about is an area that we call augmentation. So can you build a device that essentially enhances someone's ability beyond supranormal, super memory, super communication speeds beyond speech, for example? I guess superior precision athletic abilities. I think that these are very serious kind of questions to be asking now because, as you mentioned, the pathway so far is really to focus on these medical applications. I personally don't think that we've thought enough, actually, about what these kind of scenarios are going to look like. And I don't think we've thought through all the ethical implications of what this means for augmentation in particular. There's part of this that is not new at all. Humans throughout history have been doing things to augment our function. Coffee, nicotine, all kinds of things, all kinds of medications that cross over from medical to consumer, that is everywhere. So the pursuit of augmentation or performance or enhancement is really not a new thing. The questions really, as they relate to neurotechnologies, for example, have to do with the invasive nature. For example, if these technologies require surgery, for example, to do something that is not for a medical application. Again, that is not exactly new territory either. People do that routinely for cosmetic kind of procedures, for physical appearance, not necessarily cognitive. So I do think that provided the technology continues to emerge the way that it does, that it's going to be around the corner. And it probably is not going to be in ways that are super obvious. I don't think it's going to be like, can we easily memorize every fact in the world? But in forms that are going to be much more incremental and maybe more subtle. In many ways, we already have that now. Like, for example, you don't have to have a neural interface embedded in your brain to get information, essentially access to all information in the world. You just have to have, your iPhone. Whether you could do it faster through a brain interface, I definitely wouldn't rule that out. But think about this, that the systems that we have already to speak and to communicate have evolved over, thousands and millions of years, and they're supported by neural structures that have bandwidth of millions of neurons. There's no technology that exists right now that people are thinking about that are in commercial form, certainly, not even in research labs, that come anywhere close to what has been evolved for those natural purposes. So I'm essentially saying two sides of this, which is we're already getting into this now. This is not new territory. This topic of augmentation, both physical and cognitive, we've already surpassed that. That's part of what humans do in general. But we are entering this area of like enhanced cognition, these areas that I think the technology is going to be the rate limiting step and how far it can go. And we have not had the full conversations about, number one, is this what we actually want? Is this going to be good for society? Who gets access to this technology. These are all things that are going to become real world problems.
There's certainly a lot to consider. In thinking about augmentation, and another theme that I've yet to ask you about, but that I'm extremely curious about, which is facial expressions. Before we talk about the relationship between the musculature of the face and language and the communication of emotion, I'd love for you to, if you would, touch on a little bit of what you're doing with patients like Poncho to move beyond somebody who's locked in, being able to type out words on a screen with their thoughts. There's a rich array of information contained within the face and facial expression. And while somebody like Poncho going from having to, be completely locked in to being able to peck out letters on a keyboard to being able to just think of those letters and having them spelled out, that's a tremendous set of leaps forward towards normalcy. It's still far and away different than Poncho speaking with his mouth, which I think, knowing some people who are restricted, who are quadriplegic, a lot of what they struggle with in the real world is actually a height difference sometimes because they're seated while other people are standing. Right. This actually, we don't often think about this, but to always have to look up to communicate with people is a very different interface in the world. They manage quite well, of course, but could you tell us what you're doing in terms of merging the brain-machine interface with extraction of speech signals from people who are locked in, like Poncho, with facial expressions?
Sure, yeah. Well, like we described before, progress is being made. The proof of principle is out there that you can decode speech. That will continue to optimize, and I'm very confident that that's going to improve very, very quickly in the coming years to the point where it's like, not just a small vocabulary, but a large vocabulary and at reasonable rates at a level that's going to be really helpful. I'm very optimistic about that. I think it's the right time to start really thinking about a broader vision of what communication really is. So, for example, I'm here with you in person. We could have done this virtually, probably. It's pretty easy to do that. We could have recorded this really separate, but there is something about being able to actually see your expressions and to understand other forms of communication. So another really important one is nonverbal. The expressions that you're making, for example, if you have a quizzical look on your face, if I'm saying something not clear, that's a sign to me that I need to rephrase it or to say it in a different way or to slow down, for example. Or if there's something that really excites you, I want to continue to say more about it and talk more in detail, essentially about a given thing. So facial expressions actually are a really important part of the way we speak. And there's two things. It's not just the expressions of like how you're feeling and perceiving what I'm saying, but it's also seeing my mouth move and your eyes actually see my mouth move and my jaw move in a particular way that actually allows you to hear those sounds better. So having both the visual information, but also the sounds go into your brain is going to improve the intelligibility, also make it more natural.
And memory for what is spoken?
Perhaps.
So here's a call for people not just listening to podcasts, but watching them and listening to them on YouTube, I suppose, if we were to sort of translate this to
exactly
the real world.
Exactly. And the reason why we're also very interested in this idea of not just having text on a screen, but essentially a fully computer animated face, like an avatar of the person's speech movements and their facial expressions, is going to be a more complete form of expression. Now, you can imagine right now, that might just be someone looking at a computer screen interpreting these signals. But I think the way things are going in the next couple of years, a lot more of our social interactions, more than even now, are going to move into this digital virtual space. And of course, most people are thinking about what that means for most consumers, but it also has really important implications for people who are disabled, right? And whether how are they going to participate in that? And so we're thinking really about, for people like Poncho and other people who are paralyzed, what other forms of BCI can we do in order to help improve their ability to communicate? So one is essentially building out more holistic avatars, things that can essentially decode, essentially their expressions or the movements associated with their mouth and jaw when they actually speak to improve that communication.
So do you envision a time not too long from now where instead of tweeting out something in text, my avatar I'll type it out, but my avatar will just say it. It'll be an image of my avatar saying whatever it is I happen to be tweeting at that moment.
That's what we're working on. Yeah. So I don't think that is going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. And there's a lot of progress in that. And again, we're just trying to enrich the field of communication expression to make it more normal. And we actually think that having that kind of avatar is a way of getting feedback to people learning how to speak through a speech neuroprosthetic. That's the device that we call it. It's a speech neuroprosthetic. That is going to be the way that can help people learn how to do it the quickest, not necessarily like trying to say words and having it come on a screen, but actually have people feel like it's part of themselves, or that they are directly controlling that illustration or animation.
This idea of an avatar speaking out what we would otherwise write is fascinating to me. On Instagram, I post videos. I don't filter them, but I know there's a lot of discussion nowadays about people using filters to make their skin look different or the lighting look different, a lot of filtering, and also the use of captions, so that essentially what you end up with is somewhere between an actual raw video of what was spoken and an avatar version of it. Yeah. I mean, if the mismatch between what's spoken and what's in the caption is too dramatic, then it doesn't quite work. But I watch these carefully when people use captions, and oftentimes there's a smoothing of what was said into the caption, so it seems much more succinct and accurate. Oftentimes the reverse is also true, where the caption is inaccurate, and then it creates this kind of jarring mismatch. In any case, I think this aspect in the clinical realm of using an avatar to allow people like Poncho to essentially be a face that communicates through spoken language from an avatar that looks like them is fascinating and indeed important. And I think how avatars emerge in social spaces is going to be really fascinating. I get a lot of questions about stutter. I think that for people who have a stutter, it is itself anxiety provoking. Is stutter related to anxiety? If one has a stutter, what can they do? Mm-hmm. Does stutter reflect some underlying neurologic phenomenon that might distinguish between one kind of stutter and another? What can people with stutter do if they'd like to relieve their stutter?
Yeah, great question. Stutter is a condition where the words can't come out fluently. So you have all the ideas, you've got the language intact. Remember we talked about this distinction between language and speech. Stuttering is a problem of speech, right? So the ideas, the meanings, the grammar, it's all there in people's stutter, but they can't get the words out fluently. So that's a speech condition. And in particular, it's a condition that affects articulation. Specifically about controlling the production of words in this really coordinated kind of movements that have to happen in the vocal tract to produce fluent speech. And stuttering is a condition where people have a predisposition to it. So there's an aspect of stuttering, you are a stutterer or you're not a stutterer, right? But people who stutter don't stutter all the time either. So you could be a stutterer who stutters it sometimes, but not others. And really the main link between stuttering and anxiety is that anxiety can provoke it and make it worse. That's certainly true, but it's not necessarily caused by anxiety. It can essentially trigger it or make it worse, but it's not the cause of it per se. So the cause of it is still really not clear, but it does have to do with these kind of brain functions that we've been talking about earlier, which is that in order to produce normal fluent speech, we're not even conscious of what is going on in our mouths, in our larynx. We're not conscious, and if we were, we'd not be able to speak because it's too complex, it's too precise. It's something that we have really developed the abilities to do, and we do it naturally, right? It's part of our programming and part of what we learn inherently, innate, it's just through exposure. So Stuttering is essentially a breakdown at certain times in that machinery being able to work in a really coordinated way. You can think about, the operations of these areas that are controlling the vocal tract. Let's say speech is like a symphony. In order for it to come out normally, you've got to have not just one part, the larynx, but the lips, the jaw. They can't be doing their own thing. They have to be very, very precisely activated and very, very precisely controlled in a way to actually create words. And so in stuttering, there's a breakdown of that coordination.
If somebody has a stutter, is it better to address that early in life when there's still neuroplasticity is very robust? And if so, what's the typical route for treatment? I have to imagine it's not brain surgery typically. I'm guessing there are speech therapists that people can talk to and they can help them work out where they're getting stuck in the relationship to anxiety.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, part of it is about that anxiety, but a lot of it really has to do with therapy to sort of like work through and think of tricks basically sometimes to create conditions where you can actually get the words to come out. Some forms of stuttering are really initiation problems. Just getting started itself is very hard. You want to start with the initial vowel or consonant, but it won't emit. And so a lot of the therapy is really just focusing on like, how do you create the conditions, for that to happen? There's another aspect to it that I find very interesting is that the feedback, essentially what we hear ourselves say, for example, in every time that I say a word, I'm also hearing what I'm saying. So that's what we call auditory feedback. That turns out to be very important. And sometimes when you change that, it can actually change the amount someone stutters for better or for worse. And it's giving us a clue that the brain is not just focused on sending the commands out, but it's also possibly interacting with the part that is hearing the sounds. And there's something might be going on in that connection that breaks down when stuttering occurs. So there are individuals that are stutterers, but they don't stutter all the time. In those instances, there's something happening in those particular moments where this very, very precise coordination needs to happen in the brain in order to get the words out fluently.
We talked a little bit about caffeine and why you avoid it. Because your work requires such precision and calm, and frankly, to me, it seems like you're running a lot of operations, and no pun intended, in parallel when you're doing surgery, not just thinking about where to direct the instruments, but also thinking like a chess player several steps down the line, what could happen, what if then type thinking. What are some of the other practices and tools that you use to put yourself into state for optimal neurosurgery, or for thinking about scientific problems for that matter? We keep threatening to go running together, but I know you run, correct?
Yeah.
Do you find running to be an essential part of your state regulation?
Absolutely. Yeah. So for me, most exercise that I do, I really don't do for physical reasons. I do it for mental reasons. I can tell, for example, if I don't go on a run or a swim just after a day or two, and it can have translation, for example, in the way I feel in the operating room or even the way I interact with other people. So there's no question that those, the mind and body are deeply connected. And for me personally, being able to have opportunity to disconnect for a while, it turns out to be really, really important. Now, the operating room for me is another space, kind of like running or swimming, where I'm disconnected from the rest of the world. I don't bring my cell phone into the operating room. I'm disconnected from the external world for that time that I'm in the surgery. And all I am doing is just focusing. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm having complex thoughts or doing something very complicated. Sometimes it is like that, but it's not always like that. There are things that we do in surgery that are like routine and rote and are from muscle memory. So for example, suturing skin or doing certain kinds of dissection or drilling part of the bone, for example. These are all things that become very rote after a time. So for me, even being in the operating room actually can sometimes fulfill that purpose. So I really look forward to being in the operating room because that intense focus allows me to sort of disconnect from all the other things that I'm worrying about, that are happening on the outside world. We all have those kind of things that happen, and I'm certainly no exception to that. But strangely, the operating room for me is a sanctuary. I love being there because we have some control over the environment. I know what is there. I know the anatomy of the brain. My emotions are going through routines. And so for me, that's not actually very different than going on a run and letting my legs move in specific ways. It's just the same thing for my hands.
Do you listen to music or audiobooks when you run, or are you divorced from technology when you run?
Well, music helps me just stay motivated and distracted from being out of breath and and other things. And for me, it's a way to catch up with the world. So sometimes I do, but I do notice that I don't run as well, for example. In the operating room, it's a little different. Different surgeons have preferences. I'm more of the camp where I don't like any distraction whatsoever. I like people to be able to hear the words that I'm saying without having background noise. I don't really think about relying on music or other things to try to put me in a state of mind. I think just being there alone and just, trying to treat it the way it is. It's a sacred moment where someone's life is really directly under your hands. That enough kind of focuses me very quickly. And I like that. It really detaches me from a lot of things that are preoccupying me. And for those couple of hours that we have a surgery, we're just focused on one thing only.
It's fantastic. I think of, in the range of brain explorers, the neurosurgeons, those of your profession, are to me like the astronauts of neuroscience, because they're really going to the farthest reaches possible, and they're testing and probing and really at the front edge of discovering from the species that we arguably care about the most, which is humans. Eddie, I have to say, from the first time we became friends, 38 years ago,
something like
that. I'm almost reluctant to say, but so I only reveal it in part that Eddie and I became friends because both he and I shared a love of birds, and we had a club at our school, of which there were only two members, Eddie and I.
Small club.
There was one honorary member, and there were certain requirements for being in this club that we won't reveal. We took a pact of secrecy, and we're going to obey that pact of secrecy. But to be sitting here with you today, for me, is an absolute thrill. Not just because we've been friends for that long, or that we got reacquainted through literally the halls of medicine and science, but because I really do see what you're doing as really representing that front, absolute cutting edge of exploration and application. I mean, the story of Poncho is but one of your many patients that has derived tremendous benefit from your work. And now, as a chair of a department, you, of course, work alongside individuals who are also doing incredible work in the spinal cord, et cetera. So on behalf of myself and everyone listening, I just really want to thank you for joining us today to share this information. We will certainly have you back, because there's an entire list of other questions we didn't have time to get to, but also just for the work you do. It's truly spectacular.
Andrew, thanks so much. I'm very humbled, basically, by what you just said, and I feel that it's really an extraordinary honor, actually, and privilege, to be here with you and reconnect and talk about all these ideas. It's probably not random, that we ended up in similar spots and interests. I think when we were kids, it starts with some deep interests and kind of nerding out on topics, and it's probably not a coincidence, that we have such deep interest in this work now. I just feel really lucky to be able to do what I do. It's fun every day, almost every day. Be able to go to work and take care of folks and learn at the same time, and then just close the loop. How do we apply the knowledge that we learn one day to someone who comes in next week. It's really fun, and we don't know everything. We're not even close to it, but the journey to figure this out is it's really extraordinary. I mean, it's like you said, it's exploring new lands. Literally in the operating room, when I'm looking at the exposed cortex, trying to understand, is it safe to walk down this part of the cortical landscape or this other trail? You know, which one is going to be the one that is going to be safe versus the other that results in paralysis and inability to talk? Well, maybe I shouldn't call it fun, but it's very important too, in addition to being really intellectually important for how we understand how the brain works. And so, yeah, I feel just really lucky to be in that opportunity.
And we're lucky to have you being one of the people doing it. So thank you ever so much.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining me today for my discussion with Dr. Eddie Chang. If you'd like to learn more about his research into the neuroscience of speech and language and bioengineering, his treatment of epilepsy, and other aspects and diseases and disorders of the brain, please check out the links in our show note captions. We have links to his laboratory website, his clinical website, and other resources related to his critical research as well. If you're learning from and are enjoying the Huberman Lab podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a terrific zero-cost way to support us. In addition, please subscribe to the Huberman Lab podcast on Spotify and Apple. And on both Spotify and Apple, you also have the opportunity to leave us up to a 5-star review. If you have questions for us or comments about the information we've covered or suggestions about future guests, please put those in the comment section on YouTube. We do read all the comments. Please also check out the sponsors mentioned at the beginning of today's episode. That's the best way to support the Huberman Lab podcast. Not so much today, but in many previous episodes of the Huberman Lab podcast, we talk about supplements. While supplements aren't necessary for everybody, many people derive tremendous benefit from them for things like enhancing sleep and focus and hormone optimization. The Huberman Lab podcast has partnered with Momentous Supplements. If you'd like to see the supplements that the Huberman Lab podcast has partnered with Momentous on, you can go to Live Momentous, spelled O-U-S, so livemomentous.com/Huberman, and there you'll see a number of the supplements that we talk about regularly on the podcast. I should just mention that catalog of supplements is constantly being updated. As mentioned at the beginning of today's episode, the Huberman Lab podcast has now launched a premium channel. That premium channel will feature monthly AMAs, or Ask Me Anythings, where I answer your questions in depth, as well as other premium resources. If you'd like to subscribe to the premium channel, you can simply go to hubermanlab.com/premium. I should mention that the proceeds from the premium channel go to support the standard Huberman Lab podcast, which will continue to be released every Monday per usual, as well as supporting various research projects done on humans to create the sorts of tools for mental health, physical health, and performance that you hear about on the Huberman Lab podcast. Again, it's hubermanlab.com/premium to subscribe. It's $10 a month or $100 per year. If you haven't already subscribed to our zero-cost newsletter, we have what is called the Neural Network newsletter. You can subscribe by going to hubermanlab.com, go to the menu, and click on newsletter. Those newsletters include summaries of podcast episodes, lists of tools from the Huberman Lab podcast, and if you'd like to see previous newsletters that we've released, you can also just go to hubermanlab.com, click on newsletter in the menu, and you'll see various downloadable PDFs. If you want to sign up for the newsletter, we just ask for your email. We do not share your email with anybody, and again, it's completely zero cost. If you're not already following me on social media, it's Huberman Lab on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Instagram. And at all three of those places, I cover topics and subject matter that are sometimes overlapping with the information covered on the Huberman Lab podcast, but that's often distinct from information on the Huberman Lab podcast. Again, it's Huberman Lab on all social media channels. Thank you once again for joining me today for the discussion about the neuroscience of speech, language, epilepsy, and much more with Dr. Eddie Chang. And as always, thank you for your interest in science. There are also sample newsletters there that you don't even need to sign up for. You can just download the PDF or just view them on your computer or phone screen. So thank you once again for joining me for today's discussion, all about supplementation and, more importantly, how to develop a rational and especially effective supplementation protocol for you. And last but certainly not least, thank you for your interest in science.
Yeah, 4 or 5 hours, 6 hours.
So it kicks in about 90 minutes after,
right,
as I recall you saying.
Right.
I've never taken it.
Yeah.
How do people feel when they're on bromocriptine? I mean, when I hear dopamine agonists, I mean, there are a lot of illicit drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine that are increased dopamine. But then again, chocolate, sex, and food increase dopamine. But the kinetics, the time course, and the levels are different for each of those things. Dopamine, of course, being a currency of motivation and reward, not directly related to any one compound. But I would think that based on the data you just described, that and given the fact that there are a number of people out there with challenges in working memory, attention, task switching, et cetera, that there would be a strong interest on the part of the pharmaceutical companies, at least, and certainly the general public, in things like bromocriptine to increase dopamine, to increase working memory, given it is our superpower.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most disappointing things to me in my career has been that pharmaceutical companies have not picked up on this idea that we could improve cognition and very specifically improve cognitive process with very specific neuromodulators. The discovery that depletion of dopamine and not other transmitters impairs working memory was made in 1979. When I heard Pat Goengerkees talk about this as a resident, I was just amazed that there could be a single transmitter can change a single behavior. I was seeing very complicated behavioral deficits, and it just seemed impossible to me that there could be such a tight link between a single neuromodulator and a single cognitive process, and just opened the door for me that this really could be an incredibly beneficial therapy for anyone with executive function or frontal lobe function. So, but unfortunately, there's never been a pharmaceutical company that's tried to develop a drug for improving cognition to this
crazy.
Day.
And it's crazy for several reasons. One is that the data are clearly there. Two, these drugs are already established. It's not like they have to go through safety trials again. That's already been done. But mostly because regardless of whether one is a fan of the pharmaceutical industry or hates it, the pharmaceutical industry in principle can make a ton of money doing this. So I would think that they'd be heavily incentivized to do it. So why have they turned a blind eye on this?
I'm not sure. I mean, when I realized that I could test these drugs in healthy individuals, that they were, if I gave them in low enough doses, they were safe. And I had so much experience of them in patients that I felt comfortable doing it. Then I started asking pharmaceutical companies, do you want to get involved here? This should be done. I can't do this by myself. We need to have real trials and real studies of how this will help, and just it was, their eyes would always cross and never got any sort of traction. It always went back to sort of disease. What disease are you curing? What's the market for it? Is it a Parkinson's disease thing? Is it an Alzheimer's disease thing? And this has been a general problem with neurology. It's very disease centric. It's always focused on, how can we develop a treatment for Alzheimer's or traumatic brain injury or stroke, as opposed to how can we develop a treatment for working memory dysfunction, which is a problem across diseases. So the answer to your earlier question is these drugs are very safe. We give them in such low doses to healthy individuals, they don't even know, they can't even tell the difference between the placebo and the drug.
Really?
They don't even know which one they're on.
So they're not buzzing thinking like,
No.
oh, this feels good,
and
my working memory is better.
They have no idea. They don't even know their working memory is better until we show them that their working memory is better. So,
love it.
Yeah.
So they're truly blind to what's going on. Bromocriptine is but one of the dopamine agonists. Can think of a few other, cabergoline, like other things like that. Do any of these dopamine agonists exert this impact on working memory, or is it does it vary by drug because different dopamine agonists sort of hit different receptor pathways and things like that?
Yeah, no, it's not specific to the drug. I mean, the reason for bromocriptine is that it's the oldest and it's the one I was most comfortable with. I had to be comfortable with it clinically before I'd give it to undergraduates at Penn or Berkeley, so there's nothing special. But other agonists work similarly. There's a drug that's developed for Parkinson's, which is a COMT inhibitor, which actually inhibits this enzyme that we're talking about, and that also will improve, will have the same function. There's been some future work that norepinephrine also seems to be helpful with working memory. It's not as maybe not as potent as the dopaminergic. And that's the point I want to make. Another disappointing thing about this whole field of the pharmacology of cognition. I wrote a paper as a resident. Sometimes you're tending to say, hey, can you write this review paper for us? And I wrote one as a resident called The Pharmacology of Cognition, where I looked at all the animal literature on, giving neuromodulators, acetylcholine, dopamine, or whatever. And there was a lot of animal literature sort of supporting that this would work in humans, but was more striking to me was that it wasn't always just a single neurotransmitter. There were studies where you'd give dopamine and it wouldn't do anything. You give acetylcholine and it wouldn't do anything. But if you gave a low dose of both, it would be really effective. So these neurotransmitter systems don't act in isolation. So we need to also study sort of how the combinations work. And that's where where the pharmaceutical companies have the infrastructure to do these kind of studies. It's very hard to do in a single lab to do multiple drugs at one time, and then try and determine all the different interactions.
Maybe we could talk about a couple of other drugs that are legal or have FDA approval, are known to be safe in the right context, that it seems would fit the bill here for improving working memory. One is Wellbutrin, bupropion. I can never pronounce that. As far as I know, it's a epinephrine or norepinephrine agonist. You just mentioned that increasing epinephrine may have a positive impact on working memory, and to some extent a dopamine agonist. Is there any evidence that Wellbutrin can improve working memory?
Yeah, anything that boosts norepinephrine can do it. The one that we've used that's most used is guanfacine, which is actually a blood pressure medication. So that's starting to gain some traction. In fact, I think there was a study with brain fog for COVID showing that it improved symptoms with it. So there's actually some trials now that are looking at guanfacine. And so I would say anything that boosts norepinephrine would be helpful. But then again, I don't want to leave out the other transmitters. It's serotonin, increasing serotonin, increasing acetylcholine boosts other cognitive processes, and then, in a way they can help working memory. We talked about working memory being this foundation. Well, if you give acetylcholine and it kind of boosts memory, well, that can indirectly help your executive function. Or if you give a drug that improves your focus, then that can indirectly help, working memory. So what I'm really pushing for is not just a single, it's going to be one drug, it's going to be a cocktail. And we have to not only figure out what the cocktail is, but also figure out who we're giving it to, link it to the person's own makeup of their own neurochemistry. When we get to a point where we'll know, we can map out sort of everyone's dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin levels, and then we'll make real progress in helping them. Because right now I sort of say, with my students, what we're doing is it's just like cutting open the skull and just sort of pouring it onto the brain.
You're not actually doing that.
We're not actually doing it, but
right.
it seems that way. We're not. Yeah. The precision is not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's great that you developed this cognitive task that can be a proxy for dopamine levels. The cognitive task, again, being how many number or letter strings somebody can remember, basically the working memory performance. There are a lot of tests out there that claim they can assess dopamine and serotonin and acetylcholine levels from a blood draw. I've heard of the Dutch test. I've never taken it. But a few minutes ago, you said that really one needs to do positron emission tomography imaging, which is fairly labor intensive. Most people don't have access to one of those. It's a clinical tool. So there are behavioral proxies, there's neuroimaging, but also, to my knowledge, I don't know that there's any blood draw that will say, hey, your serotonin levels are low or your dopamine levels are moderate, et cetera. There are a lot of companies that market these, but are you aware of any clinical or other tools for getting an accurate read of neurotransmitter levels in a person's brain aside from neuroimaging?
No, and it's even more complicated than it seems, because the dopaminergic system is complicated because it's not only just the prefrontal cortex, as we talked about, it's also the basal ganglia. And so not only do we have to measure dopamine just generally levels, we have to measure the balance of the dopamine in the striatum and the prefrontal cortex. There's a model of dopamine function and its relation to executive function that has to do with sort of the balance between these two systems. That dopamine in the prefrontal cortex is promoting sort of stability. It's keeping information in mind, it's keeping these representations stable. Whereas the dopamine in the basal ganglia, what it's doing is allowing you to update and refresh, the information that you're holding in mind, this sort of stability versus flexibility. So if you have too much dopamine in the frontal cortex, it can lead to a very rigid state where you don't let anything in. And if you have too much dopamine in the striatum and you get too flexible, then you can get very distractible. So there's a sort of balance of dopamine. So it's not just how much dopamine you have in your brain, it's what's the balance of the dopamine. So I don't see a blood test as ever giving us that information, but I do see there being a brain test that can give us this kind of information of the two, or at least a proxy for it. So what I was thinking about when you were talking about asking this question, for example, if you measure pupil dilation, that's a pretty good proxy for the noradrenergic system.
Right. So at a given, people will wonder how to do it. We're not going to go into too much detail here, but at a given brightness in the room, what we call luminance, the pupil tends to be smaller when it's bright and larger when it's you're in a dim room. That's sort of obvious. But at a given luminance, the more alert, aroused somebody is. Arousal is a general term here, not talking about a particular kind of arousal. Then the pupil tends to be more dilated. It gets bigger the more norepinephrine is
right
in the system. So if somebody's pupils are really big in bright light, that person's got a lot of epinephrine, adrenaline in their system. Right. Do you use this clinically?
Yeah.
Like when someone comes in and they have those big old pupils?
Yeah, pupils.
And you're like, okay, they're probably on a stimulant.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what neurology does is try to look for these windows into the brain. And so I think there are a number of windows into the brain that we're going to be able to develop that can reflect these neuromodulatory systems. So that's why I've been so interested in developing biomarkers, because really what a neural biomarker is trying to develop something you can measure easily and simply and cheaply with, but gives you information about how the brain is working. And so that's that's a norepinephrine biomarker. Working memory capacity is a dopamine biomarker, and we're getting better at that. But again, we're not putting enough emphasis on it, in my opinion, to really sort of help, improve brain health.
Have you ever tried bromocriptine?
Very early on, but it's such a low dose, at the dose that my subjects were getting. But like I said, it's so low you don't feel anything. And I should say, even with patients that take it, they rarely get any side effects. Sometimes with these drugs, because there's peripheral dopamine, they can get a nausea or vomiting, but it's extremely well tolerated. You don't get anything feeling from it.
Does it change reaction time?
It does, and that's always the question of how much of this is that we're just sort of speeding up. We're just sort of making them faster. But for all the work we've done, it's pretty convincing that it's not just how fast you're doing it better.
You might find this entertaining. Some years ago, I learned that athletes were taking bromocriptine pre-Olympics and in the Olympics. I think it's a banned substance now. And the athletes that were taking it, don't ask me how I know this, but I could tell you offline. And I'm not one of these athletes, nor was I supplying the bromocriptine. We're using it because they were sprinters, and it turns out that a lot of the sprint races are won by being first out the blocks. There are other factors as well. But that reaction time, hundreds of milliseconds are the difference between podium and no podium. And bromocriptine was one of the drugs used. It was not on the banned substance list. Just a reminder that every Olympics you see, there are lots of things being used that are not on the banned substance list. And I'm not trying to be disparaging. I think there's just a lot of interest in augmenting neuromodulation for nervous system function. Bromocriptine was top of the list at that time. I think it's on the banned list now. There's a lot of use of pharmacology now on college campuses and in high school and even in elementary schools, and sometimes by parents for their kids to try and improve cognitive function. Most typically the use of Adderall, Vyvanse, Ritalin, and other stimulants, which are noradrenergic, dopaminergic agonists. Okay, so with the disclaimer, caveat, whatever you want to call it, that those decisions should always be made with a trained psychiatrist monitoring things. What are your thoughts about pharmacology for enhancing cognitive function, given that the landscape of society is challenging and people want to perform well? They need to be able to focus. We've got smartphones distracting us. And to some extent, one could say, oh, well, it's cheating to use pharmacology. But a cup of coffee is a bit of a noradrenergic agonist.
Absolutely.
And certainly improves my focus as long as I don't drink too much of it.
Right.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it kind of gets back to what we talked about there being an optimal level of dopamine in your brain. I think if you think about it as just more and more and more is better, and that more is better, then there's really no end. There's really no end. How do you know how much you should be taking? There's sort of no
That
end
experiment
to it.
was run in the 80s. It's called the cocaine
Right.
culture of Wall Street in the 80s. There
Yeah.
are movies about it, and it doesn't lead to good places.
Right. So I'm all for optimizing function. Because I want to optimize brain health, and if you have an underactive, enzyme that makes your dopamine levels, then I'm all for trying to optimize that along with everything else we need to optimize in the brain. So if we could figure out who is sort of on the lower end and boost them up, I'm all for that. The problem is we don't know if they're on the high end, and some of these athletes were actually making themselves worse. We know for sure. I mean, these are healthy Penn and Berkeley undergraduates that we made them worse on working memory tests.
By increasing their dopamine.
increasing their dopamine, just a little amount, just tipped them over just a little amount, and so we without the knowing, then it seems like it's not well informed. You're going to be taking it. The other thing is, if we're going to do this, we should do it right. I think drugs like Adderall and Ritalin, they were developed because they helped patients, but they weren't necessarily developed with knowing how exactly they worked. I mean, that's how the pharmaceutical company works.
SSRIs too.
Yeah. I mean, it works, so let's do it. I'm all for that as a physician. But if I had my choice, drugs that boost up multiple systems, all the catecholamines, the ones that boost up dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, I would steer away from those because you have no control over how you're modulating the system. Again, I was sort of talking about a cocktail. It may be a little bit of dopamine and a little more norepinephrine, but if you take something like Ritalin and Adderall, you're just getting the same amount. So it's kind of, if I was to start to sort of experiment, then I wouldn't use Adderall or Ritalin as the drug that I think would help, even though they're clinically sort of useful. I use things like bromocriptine and guanfacine where they can modulate a very specific drug, and then the goal is to optimize, and that's what we're trying to do with cognitive therapy and everything, sleeping better and better nutrition. All these are aiming to optimize, not reach some superhuman potential.
Right, just bring out the best in people's abilities.
Right.
And I'm so glad you mentioned sleep. I would say sleep is the bedrock. It's the foundation of mental health, physical health, and performance. I mean, without that, pharmacology might bridge you for an afternoon, but you're going to pay the piper somehow. Our friend and colleague Matt Walker obviously has been beating that drum for a while. What about drugs like modafinil, which are thought to be true cognitive enhancers, as opposed to drugs that just kind of are designed to ramp up levels of alertness, as many of the drugs we're discussing do?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, I think certain drugs just improve general abilities. Either they speed how fast you can process it or how efficient you can process or narrow the focus of your attention, and that just helps all abilities. So it's hard to say. I think this has to be more work on really understanding what specifically these drugs are doing. That's why bromocriptine, the dopaminergic story has been so interesting because it's a very specific effect with a very specific mechanism. I like to see that be done with other neuromodulators.
Maybe we could talk a bit about some of the disease conditions that you treat and the role of working memory and dopamine in those conditions, as well as other transmitter systems. One subject that we haven't talked about on this podcast previously, but is of tremendous interest to people, is traumatic brain injury or concussion, even mild concussion. And before we were recording today, we were talking about football, but just want to remind people that football is just one instance of an opportunity to get a concussion or traumatic brain injury. Most traumatic brain injury and concussion is not due to football. It just gets a lot of the attention. But you've got bicycle accidents, car accidents, playground accidents. Maybe you could list off a few more. But how common is TBI and concussion? And maybe you could just perhaps list out some of the other situations where you see a lot of this, that it's a bit more cryptic, that people wouldn't necessarily think that sport or that population gets TBI, but they do.
Yeah, I think concussion is much more prevalent than we realize, and the numbers have gone up and up, not because it's becoming more common, it's just it's becoming more recognized. And I think we underestimated and trivialized sort of what a concussion is. As that it's just a something that is, just you're going to recover from it. I mean, still the old school thinking by a lot of neurologists is that everyone gets better within a couple of months. Just wait it out and you'll get better. That's just the normal time course of concussion. But as we've studied it more, we realize that there's actually quite a large percentage of people who a year out, they're still suffering problems. They still feel like they're not mentally clear, and they still are sensitive to light, and they still feel a little dizzy, and just the symptom, there's a host of symptoms that just 1 year later after a concussion where they didn't even lose consciousness, that's something that they may not have even talked to their doctor about is lingering. And so it's we call this persistent post-concussion syndrome, and that's the most worrisome to me because it is true that most concussions will recover. Luckily, the brain is incredibly resilient, incredibly plastic, and it will heal itself. But there are a lot of patients where it just persists, and those are the most worrisome to me because we don't have very good interventions to try and help that. And I don't think we take these patients very seriously when they're complaining of something that seems very vague and not very specific to most doctors.
What do you tell a patient who comes in and has clearly had a concussion? Mild or severe concussion, maybe car accident, maybe a sports injury, maybe they were knocked out cold, maybe not, but they're having some headaches, some photophobia, sensitivity to light, just feeling not right. I've had a couple of these, unfortunately, and you just feel off. You don't feel quite right. And some of that manifests as focus issues. This was some years ago. I like to think I'm through it. I've had scans and I'm good. So thank goodness. But what do you tell them besides don't get another one?
Yeah, well, first of all, I explain what a concussion is. What I found in neurology, a lot of what patients want to know is they just want to understand their problem. They're not walking in expecting a cure. Just like understanding what it is, having someone understand what happened to them is very helpful and comforting. So what we mean by concussion, and in the clinical world, we use mild traumatic brain injury kind of synonymously with concussion. It basically is a tearing of axons. It's the brain cells have these long fibers that communicate with each other, and they're called axons. And when the brain violently moves forward and backwards, if you're in a car accident and you have your seatbelt on and you suddenly you go from 50 to 0, your head violently goes forward and violently goes backwards. And that angular force actually tears and stretches axons in the brain. So if you've had a concussion, you have torn some axons. I mean, luckily we have billions of them. And so if you tear a couple of thousand, you will recover, but you have torn axons. It's a real it's a real brain injury, even if you haven't lost consciousness and you've only had symptoms for a couple of days. But there's a correlation. The longer you've lost consciousness and the longer your symptoms last, the more axons you've torn. There's kind of a direct relationship between the two. So the mechanism is these torn axons. So now nerve cells don't communicate with each other, and the different brain regions are not communicating with each other. And it turns out the most common place for axons to tear is in the frontal lobes. And so now we talked about all these things that the frontal lobes do to orchestrate the rest of the brain. Well, it doesn't. It has some injured pathways, and that's why a lot of the symptoms that patients have are these kind of mild executive symptoms. This mental fogginess that they're describing is this inability to get things done. They don't lose knowledge of who they don't forget their name or forget where they live or lose memories from the past or anything like that, but they don't officially get things done as well as they used to. It only takes a little bit of a drop, right? People think you have to have a big drop in performance to have a real life impact. Just a 1% drop, and you're having a hard time doing your podcast or teaching a lecture or whatever you might do.
A 1% drop sounds like a frighteningly small change. Required to negatively impact life. So How about a poor night's sleep? I mean, what kind of drop in prefrontal cortical function are we looking at? Let's say I normally get 7 or 8 hours or 6 to 8 hours, and I suddenly only get 3 or 4. Are we talking a significant detriment?
I do think so. I do think that it is significant, a poor night's sleep, and we all notice that. I mean, it's very obvious. I mean, it's hard to sort of quantify. I'm a baseball fan, so I can quantify it. Like if you think about it in a pitcher and how fast they throw, a small drop for them, someone who's throwing 100 miles an hour, just a small drop turns them, from really elite to someone mediocre. Maybe it's more of a 10% drop, but it's still relatively small drop can have a huge impact. I think people think that just because you're a little bit off, that's not a big deal. You kind of work through it, and that's what most doctors say. Just plow through it. Just work your way through it. You're going to get better. And as opposed to saying, yeah, you really had a brain injury. This is what happened. We need to rehabilitate you just like we would do if you tore your anterior cruciate ligament. I don't know why tearing your cruciate ligament or your Achilles tendon gets more interest than tearing axons in your brain. It's amazing to me that there's more emphasis on orthopedic injuries than brain injuries.
Yeah, I don't know why that is either. I think the brain is mysterious enough that most people and many clinicians just kind of back away with hands raised. But if you are in the field of neurology or psychiatry, I suppose that then one has officially signed on to try and resolve these matters.
Right.
So for somebody that has a traumatic brain injury or low-level concussion, would part of the primary advice be to try and get one's sleep as good as possible, given that sleep deprivation can compound traumatic brain injury induced deficits in working memory. And who knows, maybe a good portion of the deficits in working memory due to traumatic brain injury and concussion is because of the sleep deprivation that it can cause. So it can get circular. Yeah.
Not only that, but one of the most common symptoms that my patients with concussion have is their sleep is disruptive. And that's true in neurology. It's fascinating. Almost every neurological disorder, my patients complain of their sleep. And I started asking, not a lot of neurologists ask you how you sleep, but I remember back from my residency, one of the first things my attending would do when we got to the ward is say, how'd you sleep last night? And it's just across the board. Patients are not falling asleep, they're not staying asleep, and it's we still don't understand why just brain injury does that. So almost every concussion patient says I'm not sleeping well, which then compounds the problem. So optimizing sleep, obviously optimizing nutrition. There's a question about activity. It used to be that we used to recommend, you had a concussion, you should don't go to work, sleep, just take it easy for a while. Don't exercise.
Keep the blinds drawn.
But now it's the idea is that you should really get up and moving as best. You got to do what you can tolerate. You don't want to give yourself you don't want to give yourself more of a headache or more light sensitivity. But as much as you can tolerate is the thought these days about sort of promoting recovery and then really getting your brain back working. I think, a lot of my patients, they're off from work for a couple of weeks and they feel fine and they think they're pretty much normal. And then the first day of work is a complete disaster because until you actually test it in real life, you don't know what kind of troubles you have. So I don't recommend going back full steam, but I do recommend going back, trying to build up these skills again. And then I think we need to develop therapies that people will use. Things like goal management training, which involves a therapist, and health insurance doesn't pay for this. So 99% of my patients don't get any help, by any kind of intervention, unfortunately. But now we talked about technology, things like Brain HQ. Do you know about Brain HQ? So no. Mike Merzenich, which I know you've talked about with Eddie, developed a company called Posit Science where developed these brain training games that can help improve specific cognitive functions, and they're very easy to do because they're online and there's science behind them, and you can do them. So that in that way, you don't have a therapist in your room, but you can online sort of do these sort of things that are targeting specific mechanisms to trying to improve the kind of things that we think are impaired by concussion. And I'd like to see more patients get started on some of those things. Unfortunately, if you go on the web and just say, I won't do brain training, you'll be overwhelmed with things and you don't know what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, I think the work that Merzenich and colleagues have done, and we'll provide a link to that. I don't have any financial stake in his work or products, trainings, that is. But I will say I think Mike's work has been tremendous. I mean, he is so far ahead of the curve. 20 years ago, everyone was talking about neuroplasticity in critical periods. They gave a Nobel Prize to it, to my scientific great-grandparents, David Huberman and Torrance Weasel, and they deserved that Nobel Prize. But there was a kind of a central tenet of neuroscience at that time was that critical period plasticity ends around adolescence or one's early 20s, and that is simply not true. And Merzenich really, I think, is one of the people who deserves credit for making it clear that plasticity is ongoing. It takes some focus and work to access it in adulthood, but that we can all access neuroplasticity, but it's there. So I don't know. They should give Merzenich a Nobel too, but I'm not on the committee. So just a little editorial there. The description of specific cognitive trainings that can improve working memory in people that have had traumatic brain injury or concussion, as well as our earlier discussion about the development of frontal lobe function and plasticity of frontal lobe function, makes me wonder, is the working memory circuitry and frontal lobe function a use it or lose it kind of circuit? Meaning, if somebody, goes to high school, graduates high school, and then gets into a lifestyle or college, and then graduates college as well, and then gets into a lifestyle where they're not reading very many books, they're definitely scrolling social media, they're carrying out their daily tasks with, apparently high degree of functionality, but they're not really pushing these forebrain circuits. Do we imagine that some of those forebrain circuits regress, aka use it or lose it? It seems to me that a few years back, maybe 10, 15 years back, there was a lot of interest in, how to maintain cognitive function. In fact, one of the most common questions I would get, even as a neuroscientist primarily focused on the visual and autonomic nervous system, was how do I keep my memory as I age? It seems to me that training it up and then continuing to use those circuits would be a really good way. Reading books without forcing oneself to finish the chapter, even though distractions jump into one's head, things like that. For me, it's when I go to the gym, I try not to bring my phone. And if I do, I'll listen to one album of music, but I won't allow myself to play on my phone. I try. Not interrupting a conversation with text messaging. Basically the landscape I'm trying to draw here is, it seems like the world is designed to disrupt, the modern world is designed to disrupt working memory and cognition of the frontal lobes.
Right. Right.
And we need to do some real training, just like muscles and atrophy and cardiac fitness atrophies if we're not doing resistance and cardiovascular training. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think, of all the systems that decline with aging, not every brain system declines, but certainly the frontal executive system we're talking about is one that takes more of a decline than others. That's just how it is with healthy aging. Not surprising. It's the most complicated system, and it's probably the most biologically costly. And so, the more complicated system is going to take more of a hit than other systems. And so, certainly, I don't know about regressing, but certainly we're maybe accelerating this decline that we know exists. But a way I would think about it, though, is that not just trying to prevent the decline, but what we talked about before, there's no reason not to optimize.
Right.
If everything is couched and I don't want to get dementia and don't want to get Alzheimer's disease and I don't want to get this and that, I think that's not the way we should be looking about it. We want to look about optimizing health and brain health and getting up to our optimal levels, because otherwise we're always playing defense instead of playing offense. And that's really hard for neurologists. We have a hard time thinking about brain health, even though we're the brain specialists. We think about brain disease. And we're just now, as a field, start thinking about preventative neurology, which seems, and thinking about it not just like stopping Alzheimer's disease, but promoting health in a healthy brain. Neurologists don't talk to patients about sort of healthy patients about being healthier.
I love how candid you are about the medical profession. And I like to think it's changing. I don't know, something happened in the 2020, 2021 era. I feel, this is just my bias, but I feel that the general public started becoming more aware of the things they might do to support their mental and physical health. Maybe they had more time on